Without further ado, I'm going to welcome our the head of pathobiology and population sciences here at the RVC to do the proper welcome. So here's Professor Ken Smith.
Thank you, Louise. It's a delight to be giving the welcome this evening. Thank you also for the applause. I don't usually get applauded when I start one of my lectures. So it is a special pleasure to welcome you all to the Royal Veterinary College for the keynote lectures which launch year 8 of IFSTAL. I think you're all familiar with IFSTAL as supporters, new students and friends of the initiative, but for those of you who are maybe just a little bit less familiar, IFSTAL is a unique collaboration between 5 universities, the Royal Veterinary College, the School of African and Oriental Studies, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford, and the University of Warwick. And that collaboration, I think, is unique in terms of the level of skill sharing, networking that has flowed from that. And I guess one should always mention COVID once in these coming through these difficult times, but I think if COVID has taught us anything, it's about the importance of teamwork and the importance of resilience and the importance of valuing different skills and expertise in solving problems. So my background is a veterinary surgeon, and I can speak on behalf of the Royal Veterinary College to welcome you, but also to say how much the RVC cherishes our role in IFSTAL. I think we were able to bring our skills and expertise, particularly in animal health and welfare, animal health economics, veterinary public health, and One Health, to the array of skills and expertise across the partner institutes. So before handing on to John Ingram, who will introduce our 2 speakers at the keynote lecture, just some words of thanks to colleagues who've been working very hard, both front of house and behind the scenes, to make this evening a success. So particular thanks to Louise Watford and to Nico Dadios, who are the RVC hosts for this evening. Thanks to John Ingram as the lead academic and program leader for IFSTAL. And also thanks to Roger Sykes as the IFSTAL project manager, who has been doing an enormous amount of work with the local team behind the scenes to ensure the smooth running of this, this evening. So welcome to the Royal Veterinary College. I wish you a wonderful evening here, and pass on to John to introduce our speakers.
Thanks very much indeed. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this, the launch of IFSTAL Year 8. We're really pleased that we're still going. It's been a tremendous journey for those of us who've been involved, and I believe for the over 2,500 students who've been part of that journey. It's really good to see you all today, particularly for this launch evening where we have the launch lectures. And the public lecture has been a feature of IFSTAL since the get-go, really. And it's a real pleasure to have two wonderful speakers this evening to share some thoughts, particularly challenging times at the minute for many. And I think nobody's in a better position to discuss some of those than our first speaker, Anna Taylor, who's Chief Executive of the Food Foundation. You may well have seen her on the TV or heard her on the radio or read her work. But over her many years as starting as a nutritionist, working a lot in the developing world and the development sector, is now focused for the last 7 or 8 years here in the UK, particularly looking at those members of society who are less well off and who are particularly suffering under whatever the stress and strain of the moment is. And I think the food price issue at the moment and the cost of living crisis is for many a really big challenge. So let me welcome Anna. Just before handing over to her, I do encourage you to have a look at the web. There's a remarkably good report out called The Broken Plate. There's some fresh news come out yesterday, which I think you'll be sharing with us tonight. And it's a really salutary message. but it's something where food system thinking can help. And that's why we're so pleased that Anna's here to share some of her thoughts. So let me hand over to you. Anna, welcome.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's wonderful to meet you all. I'm Anna, as John said, and I head up an organisation called the Food Foundation. And if you've not heard of us, we're an organisation that's working here in the UK, right across the food system, to try and make it easier for people to eat healthy and sustainable diets. So what we do is oriented towards 4 key stakeholders, people that we feel are really have the strongest levers of power to try and change the food system here in the UK. So those are policymakers at the national level and at the local level, city authorities and local authorities. The business community, obviously operating right across the food system, and investors who invest in those businesses and have leverage over business behaviour. So those are the audiences that we primarily speak to as an organisation, and we bring to them evidence about what's going wrong with the food system and present solutions that we want them to consider. Obviously, at the moment here in the UK, we have a very severe food price inflation situation, cost of living crisis. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing on that, or some of the evidence that we've been generating as well, and give you a little bit of the sort of wider context as to why we're experiencing that cost of living crisis and what needs to be done about it from a kind of food systems perspective. So you'll be probably familiar with aspects or all of these elements from what you've read in the news. But I think it's probably important to say right from the beginning, in terms of understanding why we have a cost of living crisis here in the UK, there are multiple answers to that question, and they often interact and feed off one another and create other problems as initial problems emerge. And obviously that's a kind of feature of thinking about the system and how, when things change in the system, what the consequences of those changes are and what the ripple effects are across the whole system. So we've seen, coming out of the COVID pandemic, globally, the market tightening around gas prices. Gas prices, of course, have a knock-on effect in terms of the cost of producing fertilizer. That in turn, carbon dioxide is a byproduct of fertilizer production. So in turn, that has a knock-on effect on the price of carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is used to stun animals and is used in food packaging to prolong shelf life. So you can see sort of very quickly that a change over here has all of these knock-on effects through the system. We've obviously had the Ukraine war, which is ongoing, which has had immediate impacts in terms of access to wheat for countries that rely on imports of wheat, neighbouring countries, and beyond, and of course also vegetable oil, of which Ukraine was such a massive producer. But also potash, which is produced in the region, and we've seen the kind of ongoing geopolitics around the Russian gas pipeline to Europe. And of course, all of these things, the shock that the Ukraine war and its impact on supply chains created, also then triggered many countries to think about export restrictions and quota bans and so forth, which in turn themselves create other knock-on effects on the wider market and on prices. If you're interested to look at sort of what's happening on export restrictions, I definitely recommend IFPRI have a fantastic tracker, which tracks literally day by day where countries are making decisions which are affecting what's going in and out of their countries, and with the potential knock-on effects on the world trading system. Here in the UK, we have a unique set of contexts that result from Brexit, not least on labour, and particularly for parts of the food system which have been very dependent on migrant labour into the UK. So notably farming, for picking and harvesting, and also in hospitality sector, which have been very badly hit. And then in addition to that, new border restrictions, which have created friction at borders, prolonged transit times, which again, having knock-on effects on prices. This is all in a backdrop of growing number of climate-related shocks. Of course, we know that climate change is creating more frequent extreme weather events. I mean, just this summer, we've seen heat waves in India, fires in Tunisia, floods in China, drought in Southern Europe affecting wheat and maize. So on an ongoing basis, shocks in different parts of the system, which are affecting production. And of course, when they affect big production areas in the way that they have in Ukraine, and the way that the war has in Ukraine, that creates those very, very significant knock-on impacts on the wider system. And I think the other point that's important to note is that one of the reasons why we're experiencing this cost of living crisis so badly here in the UK, and also to some extent in other countries, are because we haven't placed very much importance on the resilience of the system and really making sure that we have sufficient buffer, whether that's, for example, in storage of natural gas here in the UK, or in the system itself, or for that matter, at a sort of household and individual level, in our ability to actually have financial resilience to cope with periods of inflation. And in fact, here in the UK, we've experienced years now of people on very low income having benefits being cut back, so that disposable income now for the poorest families, in comparison to say 2008, when we saw the last food price shock, is a much lower. We've also seen, of course, wages not keep pace with the cost of inflation in the UK. So even if people are in work, their money isn't going as far, which again contributes to the effects of the cost of living crisis being having very significant impacts on households. So just to give you some of the stats, we track a basic basket of goods. This is a Tesco basket, which is within broad nutritional parameters of the government's dietary guidance, so within broad health parameters. This basket, we've been tracking this since April the 1st on a weekly basis. It's gone up more than 15% in that just over 6-month period. Today, you may have seen that the Consumer Price Index, this is the government's Office of National Statistics data, was published. This is published on a monthly basis. Food price inflation over the last 12 months with the CPI data is at 14.5%. The CPI data, the CPI basket, the Consumer Price Index basket, is quite, it's not a basket that you could imagine a family going out and buying. It's reached through a various set of methodological requirements, but it doesn't look like a basket of goods. And what we show here is that the reality in terms of actually a grocery shop suggests that our data is suggesting that that's a slightly steeper line than the CPI data is showing. We have a basket that's for a man and for a woman because dietary requirements are slightly different, particularly overall calorie levels. And you can find all this on our food price tracker on our website. So what does this really mean for families? We've been tracking what we call food insecurity since the start of the pandemic. The reason we did this was because the government tracks this data as well, but it does so on an annual basis and with a 12-month time lag. And so it's the ability for the government data to really pick up that rapidly changing situation and create a pulse of data that policymakers need. Was lacking. And so we filled that gap, and we've now done, in fact, 11 surveys, the most recent of which we published yesterday, and which featured on Newsnight, in fact, on Monday night, if you happen to see it. And what we do when we're gathering food insecurity is we ask 3 key questions about experiences of food insecurity, and those are disaggregated in the key there. So you're asking about whether people have had smaller meals or skipped meals, been hungry or not eaten for a whole day. This data relates to a 1-month recall period. So you're asking that whether people have experienced one of those things or more than one of those things over the last month. And if the answer is yes to any of those, then they're counted as moderately or severely food insecure. They're in that category. And you can see here the trend line. I mean, this is from the first 2 weeks of lockdown, when there was an immediate shock with food not on the shelves in Britain, which obviously had affected households that had no stocks at home. But you can see that now levels of food insecurity are rapidly rising and the highest that they've ever been in the period that we've been measuring. I think it's also important to note, so we're here now, 18.4% of households experiencing food insecurity in the last month, 9.7 million adults. I asked the team to pull out the data for students, full-time students. Thought you'd be interested in that. And in fact, 25% of full-time students are moderately or severely food insecure. So students are at higher risk. Full-time students are at higher risk of experiencing food insecurity than the general population. And so are households with children. And we're particularly concerned about this group at the moment. And we're concerned about everyone, to be honest. But you can see here that with this trend line, these are households with children in the blue line, households without children on the red line, and how those lines are now starting to diverge quite significantly. So households, if you have children, there are obviously a number of additional costs which go with having children. If you have young children, you also have childcare costs, which can be very significant for households. But importantly, some of the measures which the government has put in place to try and help people through the cost of living crisis have involved flat payments to households, regardless of whether the household has one person in it or 5 people in it. And so inadvertently disadvantaging households which have children. And in fact, when we break this data down and we actually look at households with 1 child, 2 child, 3 children, you see a very steep gradient to the point where if you've got 3 or more children, levels of food insecurity are in the 43%, I think it was. So a really very worrying situation for households with children. And just to give you a very small example of how this is playing out for families, because don't forget, these are households that are facing food price inflation, which I've talked about, but also rapidly rising costs of energy and knock-on impacts on utility bills. So we were talking to a family just this week, my team was a mother who was basically saying, I'm having to decide whether to put the broadband on so the kids can do their homework or cook them a hot meal. And you're kind of making very, very fine-grained choices because the budgets are so wafer thin in terms of being able to make some of these really essential choices about how they spend the resources for their children. So that's what does this actually mean for diets? This is a slide, and apologies if you can't read the small text from the back, but this is a visual that was in the National Food Strategy Evidence Pack. So the National Food Strategy was an independent review as part of the team that produced it. It was commissioned by the government and published just over a year ago. What this shows is the price per calorie up the left-hand side, and across the bottom, the nutrient profile score. So this is a measure of the nutritional quality, essentially, of different products that are on the market. And this is a full sweep of all the products that are available in supermarkets. And products which have a nutrient profile score of 4 and above 4, and therefore on the right-hand side of the graph are products which are not very healthy. And products on the left-hand side are the healthy products. And you can see price per calorie, you can see there that quite clearly that healthier foods per calorie tend to be more expensive than unhealthy foods on the right-hand side. And you've got some little examples of categories in there. So some things like lentils and beans, really nice and cheap per calorie on the left-hand side, but obviously lots of fruits and vegetables being quite expensive. So you can expect then it wouldn't be, it's not surprising perhaps that if people have pressure on their budgets, they're going to be drawn towards foods which offer bigger bang for their buck in terms of price per calorie. And you can see also here with this data what's actually happening in terms of how food price inflation now is playing out across different categories. This is a breakdown of the CPI data, and you can see how different categories are affected by inflation. But when we actually do that same breakdown as on the previous slide between healthy and unhealthy foods, we find that healthy food has increased on average at 5.1%, whereas unhealthy at 2.5%. So a much faster rate of increase amongst healthier foods, which inevitably will have knock-on impacts on the quality of diets. And when we ask people in our survey, the one that was published yesterday, we asked them about, in the past month, are you cutting back or buying more of different categories of food? You can see here quite significant differences between the food insecure households on the left, the food secure households on the right, and the extent to which they are cutting back on purchases of fruits and vegetables. Very kind of marked difference between food secure and food insecure households. So you can fully expect that the cost of living crisis is not only creating enormous stress and knock-on impacts on health that come from material deprivation, but also effects on diet quality with long-term impacts resulting on health. And there's a bunch of data which really talk about the links between food insecurity and health outcomes. The link there to a briefing that we've done with the National Energy Action Organization, which focuses on what happens if children are food insecure and living in fuel poverty, and what the consequences are for their health, which are really significant. And there's now a sort of growing body of evidence, largely from other countries in North America, showing that children living in food insecure experience a range of immediate health consequences in the forms of things like asthma, chronic health, skin allergies, cold, stomach problems, depressive symptoms, and a whole series of knock-on impacts on their mental health, which often stay with them into adolescence and into adult life. And on the right-hand side there, you see some data from Canada, which shows how food insecurity is also a marker of demand for health services and the knock-on impacts in terms of healthcare costs, where food secure people need less, they go to the emergency department less, they need support from their doctor less, in comparison to those that are severely food insecure, who place quite significant demands on the health service. So sort of idea that you can't afford to provide support to very low income families needs to be set in the context of those long-term health costs which go with food insecurity. So I think finally, just to say that food price shocks are here to stay. This is an extreme event that we're experiencing right now, but there's been a number of food price shocks in the last 15 years. And we can fully expect that with climate change, these are going to continue. And so therefore, we've got to think about two things. One is, how do we reduce the impact of the food system itself on temperature rises? Because all the time that the food system is contributing between 25 and 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, the food system is part of this problem and locked in this kind of cycle of problems. And obviously, the big thing to think about in that is meat consumption and meat production, and the role that plays in contributing to the greenhouse gas sort of footprint of the food system. And then secondly, how we try and build up the resilience of the system. And there are, of course, numerous ways in which we need to be thinking about that. And not least, how we can reorient the system so that if people are pressed for money, it's not such a toxic environment for them. At the moment, if you've got very little money, everything is pointing to you towards eating in a way which is worse for your health. How do we create a system which actually makes it much easier for people on a low income to eat well and makes that the norm? And that's the real challenge in terms of re-incentivizing the system. I think I'll leave it there and perhaps cover more in questions. Thanks.
Anna, thank you very much. Well, Anna's going to have to leave quite soon. So before actually moving on to our second speaker, can we just fire a few questions to you so we make sure we have the chance to discuss anything with you, because you've given us such a wealth of things to think about. So folks, any specific questions to Anna on what we've heard? Cost of living crisis, healthy food? Yes, please. 1 and 2.
How do we go about presenting resilience to the general public, to citizens? It doesn't seem like in a current political climate or anything like that, it would be the sexy thing to be talking about, to be saying that's, you know, make yourself more resilient, let's focus on preparing ourselves for the future, when people will most likely say, we're in a crisis now. We just need to get out of the crisis now, and then we should have thought about this. You know, we can think about it when we're better, but then as we see when we're better, think about it, and then we just keep going on the way, because what's been like. So how would we convince governments and citizens thinking about prevention rather than just response?
It's a really good point. And in fact, some of the reactions that we've seen to the current crisis have actually moved us away from being more resilient. So in fact, the knee-jerk kind of response. So for example, in the UK here, you know, we've got a program of trying to pay farmers, just getting off the ground, pay farmers for environmental outcomes. And there's this kind of like, oh, should we put the brakes on that, because we really need just to boost national food security and grow more in every square inch of land that we possibly can. So yeah, you're right. That's a massive risk. I think I've worked a lot on big emergencies in sub-Saharan Africa in my last life, before I worked at the Food Foundation. And what we found there was that immediately after a crisis, investment in things like early warning systems and that sort of thinking about the longer term, there's a sort of sweet spot of time immediately after that when people are willing to have those conversations and want to have them. The interest dissipates quite quickly, but I think that is the time. That is the time to do it. But other than that, it's a very good question. And I don't think I have a really good answer.
I mean, it is a real challenge, the difference between responding to the crisis and preparedness.
Yeah, exactly.
How one works against the other. Anyway, that was a good question. There was one at the back, then over to this lady. Yes, please. Speak up, please, if you're.
Hold on.
Hello. Hi, thank you for the talk. You mentioned that you thought that some of the government's current policies are quite ineffective because they're kind of blanket across households. I was wondering how effective you think something like a universal basic income might be in helping to blunt some of the impacts of price shocks.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fantastic idea. I think we are a very, very long way in the UK from a real conversation about that now, unfortunately. I mean, the context at the moment is so extreme. You can't even get free school meals extended to children that are living in poverty, or we can't, there's a debate about whether or not benefits should go up in line with inflation rather than wages. So, I mean, absolutely, that's the direction we should be going in longer term. But the political economy around this issue is really, really difficult at the moment. That, of course, politics are changing literally on an hourly basis at the moment. So who knows if that will be the same answer in 6 months, 12 months time. But for now, that's the reality we're in.
This lady had a question.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. Please bear with me while I just formulate my question. But obviously there's more and more research that's emerging to say that plant-based foods are better for the environment, better for health and all of those things. But obviously it's also not okay to just tell people, just eat plant-based because it's better for you. Like don't eat meat, because then would you encourage people to eat more sugar just because it's not, meat or dairy? So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, on how food distributions and what makes up a balanced diet is changing with the way that the climate's going? Sorry, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously we're seeing I think there's an important distinction to draw between what I would call like alternative proteins, alternative meats, and then the broader range of plants that you might eat instead of meat, lentils, vegetables, and so forth. And obviously on the former, we're seeing huge amounts of investment going in, private equity and so forth, into developing these new products, which in time, aren't yet, but in time will become cheaper than meat. And will probably at that point become something that there's a sort of mass switch to, through particularly those as ingredients in processed foods. So we kind of won't even know we're making the switch necessarily. Whether that is a net positive for health, in my mind, is a big question. Some of those products remain very highly processed, and there's a growing body of science around the risks attached to highly processed foods that might be even independent of the ingredients which are in them, but more to do with the ways in which that processing happens and the chemicals, etc., involved. So the challenge from my perspective is, how do we help people switch away from meat in a way which delivers both those environmental and health benefits, and which don't keep us locked in a way of eating at the moment, which is with a huge amount of highly processed foods. You know, at the moment, about 50-60% of our calories come from ultra processed foods. How we actually use that switch as a step towards a better way of eating overall, rather than kind of more of the same. And that's the big challenge. And I think at the moment, the sort of market forces are against that going in the right direction, to be honest.
Seems a lot of it is to do with quality rather than quantity.
Yeah.
How are you? I know you've got to rush, but already.
I've got a few more minutes if you want.
Okay. Any other question? Yeah, I can see. Well, I saw one there first. Very succinct question, please. Right at the very back.
She's going to run all the way up.
Oh, well, like, around and around you're heading.
Hi, thank you for your talk this evening. So my question is, as organizations working in this field, so I, for example, work in policy, how can we help consumers create those dietary and behavioral changes which are better for the environment, for their wallets, and for the economy overall? So things like policy and campaigns.
Sure. So, I mean, the best way, of course, is through policy. So rather than through giving people information and expecting them to do the heavy lifting. So we like to talk about sort of three big buckets of things where policy intervention is needed, and better business behavior as well, which obviously policy intervention can shape. So price and affordability. At the moment, as that visual showed, the prices are in the wrong direction. You want to tip it so that all of those foods which are healthier are on average cheaper than the unhealthy foods. So a tipping of the balance of prices, and whether you have to think about fiscal measures to do that, obviously. Those can go in multiple directions and be intervened at different points to deliver that, but that's what's required. The second bucket is what we call appeal, so the marketing and advertising piece, or the extent to which that really flows through to sort of norms of behavior. So what are the things which are promoted? What are the things which everyone's investing in, that taste, sensation, and are they the right kinds of food? So, all the ways in which we make food appealing to people. And then the third area is availability. So is this stuff actually, is your high street just dominated with fast food outlets, and you can't find a greengrocer or a supermarket that's got cheap fruit and veg in it anywhere nearby without a bus ride or away? Or even within the category, if you're looking at a set of ready meals, can you actually buy a ready meal which is plant-based and a reasonable price and isn't loaded with salt, for example? So the sort of three big chunks which policymakers need to be thinking. Of course, there are multiple policy levers which can be used under those three things. But the key thing is, how do you change the environment in which people are making decisions about what they eat? That's the fastest way to change diets.
There you go. Okay, folks, one last very quick question, please.
Sure. So in the United States, where I'm from, we know that around 40 million tons of food is wasted each year. And I know that obviously food waste contributes not only to the deficit that we're seeing now, as well as a lack of resilient systems. I'm wondering if you have examples of good, both local and then systems level interventions to reduce food waste and build better systems for resilience.
Right, it's not my area of expertise, so I work, and I'm sure there are others here who know a lot more, but I think where the real activity is focused at the moment in the context of all of this in the UK around food waste is siphoning off food surplus rather than, you know, food that actually needs to be got rid of. And using it for other purposes. So whether that's free food distributions or to people on a low income, or I think much more interestingly, creating secondary markets for those foods. And we're starting to see it more, for example, around what we call wonky fruit and veg. I mean, that's becoming now, sales of those categories are growing really rapidly in the context of the cost of living crisis.
Like
So,
I'll get salary in like maybe 1 week, around 5 months together, because Urdu also knows it, transferring from UK to Kashmir, because I'm temporary employee with them. It is going on from 1 month. Only Abdul filled my bank details. So it can come anytime, maybe today, tomorrow, or within 1 week, okay?
You've been hurt, Danny.
yeah, I know. I was thinking there's going to be somebody who's going to give you a great answer to that question.
Excellent.
Okay.
Do you need to rush?
Yes, I
think
probably
you do.
should go.
Good. Well,
But
thank you very
so
much
much for being
Anna,
here.
for
Lovely to meet you. Good luck with the talk.
Well, Anna was giving us a lot of examples with her slides of what's been happening with this crisis over the last couple of years, particularly in relation to COVID, of course, and then the concomitant issue with the Ukraine and the climate shocks. Obviously, shocks and crises happen, but many people in the world kind of live with an ongoing crisis. And how is that handled differently? We have another speaker now, our second speaker, Dr. Marouche Tak, who's here in the RBC. She's a lecturer in agribusiness, an applied economist who's really interested in the notion of agricultural policies, and particularly in low and middle income countries. So one of the important things is the role of public expenditure in diversifying diets, as we're just touching on it with that last question, but also with antibiotic usage in the livestock production. And antimicrobial resistance is a big challenge, as we know, growing in the world. There's a lot of stuff to talk about. I think it's probably best to hand over straight away to Marouche, if you're ready to share your thoughts with us now. Thank you very much.
I won't be talking about AMR today, and thanks. Let me come here so I can see my slides. Perfect, thanks. Actually, I just remembered 8 years ago, the first day I ever visited RBC was in this room for an IFSTAL's lecture when I was on the other side. So it's come a full circle today. And IFSTAL has been quite informative to my thinking on food systems. So I'm hoping that this journey for you also culminates into some interesting stuff for you guys. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to move away from the UK and talk globally a little bit more theoretically, but hopefully I'll bring in some stories and positive stories and talk about resilience. Someone there was asking that question, but perhaps in a different scenario where crises or where conflict has been going on for a really long time. So imagine what's going on in the UK, but for years and for a long period of time, but add warfare to that situation. It's like almost like a game when something's happening and then add another crisis situation to it. How do I define protracted crises? And I mean, it's not my definition, this is a more universal definition, and this is a slightly older slide, but that's okay. The definition that I'd like you to take on today is both of these, but the second one in particular, those environments in which a significant portion of the population is acutely vulnerable to disease, death, and disruption of their livelihoods over a prolonged period of time. So the critical thing is, it's a prolonged period of time, and it's, oh, this is a very old version of the slide deck. Hang on, let me just quickly check before I go on talking about this. This is not the slide deck at all. This is definitely not the slide deck. I'm wondering where this is this the one? Sorry, let me just, Louise, do you have your WhatsApp open, or is this where the slide came from, or?
No, but we can, sorry, do
just
chat amongst yourselves for 2 seconds.
I can bring my laptop if that helps.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Noise, like the volume.
My Zoom. It's
All
all
right.
connected to my Zoom account. And
Someone was speaking.
yeah.
All
I just
right.
have to quickly mute someone.
No worries.
Okay, so how am I going to get this on? That's the next thing, isn't it?
Right. I can link up via Zoom on my laptop if you want. Yeah. Or if you want, open your webmail and I'll just send you the slides.
Yeah.
Okay, then we don't. That's a very old slide. I could not have worked with that.
No, that's.
How do you even get that slide deck?
I don't know. Magic.
Maybe you sent a link to, must be me.
No.
Okay, I've sent it to you.
Send it to me. Okay, I just put it down for now.
Yeah. I think it had. No? Okay.
No.
It's still scanning. Okay. Fine.
It's all smoothly set up as well.
It must have been my mistake. The link I must have sent you would be an old one. Okay, perfect. Do you want to put the first?
I'll just do that now.
Yeah. Right, perfect. Yeah, go for it.
Sorry about that, everybody. Slight technical hitch. We've got the slides back up, so welcome back to Dr. Marouche Tak.
Yay! Right. Yes, we definitely have the right slides now, but oh, there we go. Perfect. Great. So, I mean, there were minor things, but the last few slides were definitely not there. So I'm glad we have them now. So I was talking about how the productive crises are when people do there's a significant portion of the population that's acutely vulnerable, and often these crises stem from political conflicts, but they're not always within or between nation states. So it's not that two nation states are always fighting with each other. It could be within a country. There may be a region that is in protracted conflict or protracted crises. So why should we who are here thinking about food systems today be talking about protracted crisis? The reason is that 500 million people affected by these kind of long-term crises. And almost 75% of children under 5 that are stunted live in these kind of conditions. Now, since 2010, the proportion of undernourished people living in these protracted crises have increased, whereas everywhere else in other developing countries, malnutrition and undernutrition has been decreasing. This shows that conflict compounded by fragility and other stress factors leading to protracted crisis substantially increases the likelihood of undernourishment. So today, what I want to discuss in the next 10, 12 minutes is these 3 things. So why are there these regions with long-term conflicts? Why do they get limited attention from academia and from international development experts? And how does the protracted nature of the conflict impact the food system? Hopefully, after all of the doom and gloom, I will be able to leave you with on a positive note when I talk about what are the stories of systems of food systems resilience in these spaces, because these people still exist after 10, 20, 30 years of conflicts. What is going on there in those food systems? And hopefully we can come back to the question of resilience there. Now, I do need my notes, which are obviously not, I can't see here, but I will have access to them on my laptop. There we go. If I can. Okay. There, yeah. So you may have noticed the emphasis on the plural and crises. It's because regions affected by protracted crisis often show high vulnerability to both environmental change and also socioeconomic fragility. Now, as such, these populations are affected by multidimensional vulnerabilities, and people are often see shocks, which are usually very pointed, one-time single events, but also stressors, which are more long-term in factors that affect the food system. And it's our knowledge of these stressors that is quite limited at the moment, which is why we are unable to actually, we poorly conceptualize protracted crisis at the moment. Now, our understanding is usually based on this dichotomous explanation of conflict and nutrition in conflict spaces. One is these spaces need humanitarian assistance, and the other side, it's a economic development challenge. But both these approaches ignore the structural cause of conflict, and often they're based on subjugation, because these conflicts are often based on subjugation of marginalized populations and their land. And so in this analysis, the analysis of war and imperialism are absent from both these ways of understanding conflict. So what happened? How do we then characterize protracted crisis? And one of the main things that happen in these spaces is that agriculture can be targeted as a weapon of war. So it's often you'll see that stocks, like fields have been destroyed or livestock is lost, and storage of food is also targeted. And people who manage pastoralists, particularly their restriction of movement, affects the way they are able to herd their animals. And as the longevity of the crisis increases, what becomes of these economies is they become low investment economies, and public sector is often not interested in investing in agriculture there. And so there is no incentive for the private sector also to invest, whereas a rate of investment on any kind of household or on agriculture is almost nil. This damages the horizontal and vertical linkages in the food system and increases transactional costs. In particular, this affects transportation. So even where food may be available, distribution of food in these spaces is extremely difficult because of blockages on roads, or cold storage is not available, and perishability of the food items. And I come to perishabilities because value addition in these spaces over time, due to lack of investments, is extremely low, and agro-processing suffers and perishability increases in this case. So you have heaps of rice that may not be able to move, but is also not stored in the correct way, or milk that may be produced in a village but is unable to be sent to the other village next door. So food crops and animal source foods are usually consumed without processing, as industrial processing is almost non-existent. And these crises can often lead to food production being turned into cash crop production because to increase the disposable income or purchasing power of households. Nevertheless, as I said, these food markets exist. For example, in Afghanistan, here's a butcher standing on the road, sitting on the roadside, really. And in Rojava, in northern and eastern Syria, you see a corner shop with all the many amenities. And Rojava is almost in their 10th year of violence, now, of conflict now. And here is a picture from quite a large, one of the largest, almost one of the largest, like Central Asian fruit market in Kashmir, where the boxes that you see is full of apples at the moment. So what is happening in these systems where does the resilience, so where if these markets exist, where there is some sort of inherent resilience in these markets, and what is going on there is what the question my team and I wanted to ask over here. So today, hopefully, I will give you some examples of resilience. And for this, I need my notes. Okay. In these spaces, what happens is, what we realize is that communities tend to organize themselves as the state is absent or retracts itself from being able to support the communities. These communities then fall back on traditional ways of knowing and producing and consuming food, which may have existed prior to any nation state was formed in these spaces. And this is because the traditional forms of production are resilient to operating during duress in low input situations that protracted crisis come along with. So what you see is traditional agriculture knowledge helps in these communities to take control over food supplies using locally available production methods, and also a diversification of crop production. And because of movement restrictions, your value chain tend to become shorter, which is actually helpful for consumption purposes. So taking the example of Kashmir, here's a picture of kitchen garden, which most households still have in Kashmir, which it's in its third decade or fourth decade almost of violence, militarized violence. And these land reforms in the 1960s, 70s, what they did is distribute land back to the peasants and the population. So that means even when there are 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks of lockdown, people will have some sort of land to till on and grow their own vegetables. This also links to this food tradition of drying food in summer. So you see over here a woman who was cleaning and cutting her turnips, but also has other dried vegetables, including aubergines and then tomatoes and some spinach in the other basket. And this is very much part of like the resilience mechanism in Kashmir, where if every household will have some of this, then they will produce this by themselves. And this is not necessarily something that they buy from the market. And the reliance on non-commercial herbs, which are foraged also in winter, is quite high. So we'll see dandelion greens or sorrel that have been, foraged from like the neighboring areas. And one thing that I found very interesting is that there is every food system actor group in Kashmir has a union. So even the bread makers have their own union, or the bread sellers, forget about the bread makers, and apple producers have their own union. And the reason they have unions is actually, it's just an association that actually centralizes any kind of communication or activity in the absence of a state existing there, or even to negotiate, in Kashmir's case, with the state. So this self-organizing communities, they're usually a departure from your traditional form of governance, where governments provides public goods, but instead these local communities then organize themselves in these spaces and to de facto as like what a state would then normally do. So in Rojava in northern and eastern Syria, you also see something similar by smallholder cultivators and self-organized into co-ops. This in particular is a female cooperative that aggregates tomatoes and other things. But the basis of food production or food systems in Rojava is that production is grounded first and foremost in meeting the needs of the local population, and at like a very affordable price. So affordability is very much key in this region. And only surplus production is then sold into local markets. And what this does is it creates new regionally embedded markets as a medium of social political control over provisions of food. So you're controlling the provision of food for your population by producing and consuming it within, and also giving surplus to neighboring spaces. And so this form of organizing communities is a departure from traditional forms of governance where, as I said earlier, governments provide public goods. Now, the third example that I want to take is of Palestine, where again, this traditional knowledge of cultivating land is critical to food systems resistance and resilience there. It's because previously Palestinian farmers would be growing fruit, but because of water intensive cultivation of fruits, now they moved on to olive production, which it takes less water to produce due to water restrictions in the region. And in Palestine and other similar spaces, procurement of inputs such as seed and saplings do not necessarily come from a formalized market. They come from your neighbors or from families and other informal markets. And providing improved seeds, as development assistance organizations suggest, is not always a good option in these spaces because traditional varieties most likely respond better to low input conditions that are prevalent in these crises. So what I want to leave you with today is these pictures of a kitchen garden in Kashmir, apples in Kashmir, and then olives growing in Palestine, with this almost like a question to yourself on how relying on the tradition or what we think is traditional food systems are actually not the origination of our food systems, and perhaps going back to those traditional knowledges and think about how they can be supportive of the new future that we want to generate and the new future for food systems. Yes, and yeah, the main point being that we need to move away from this notion of like nation state trying to be the provider of public goods. And obviously that I'm not talking about in the UK, but I'm talking about spaces where the state is not on your side, but perhaps there are some things that we can learn from these spaces also. Finally, I want to end on just giving a shout to my team, Dr. Lauren Blake, who also used to actually be one of the key organizers for IFSTAL a few years ago, and now she's at Bristol. Haris Dargar, who is based at the Institute of Social Sciences in The Hague, and Babar Hussain and Emma Walton, also, who have been very critical to the work that we are doing in the funders over here. And that's it. After, I guess.
Well, thank you very much. What a lot to think about. A wholly different situation to that Anna was describing, but for those people living there, you know, equally challenging to the people Anna was referring to here. I was just struck by your last comment. You know, the point about the move away from a situation where the state is not really the guaranteed provider of what you need, and that's quite a statement, isn't it? Yeah. So in that situation, one just kind of goes back to what we've been seeing as more traditional systems, which have some resilience to that. What happens when a shock comes on top of the stress?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I suppose what I've found in these, at least in the 3 cases, but there are also many other cases like that in the world where, because the people are so used to the shocks in the system, they have other ways of responding to them. So in the case of Kashmir, which I know the best because that's why my research primarily is based, there's a whole lot of storage that happens at home. So a ton of rice in everyone's house because they know that this is likely to happen regularly, for example. And this all comes from like the tradition of being a mountainous area, and they're used to storing food for winter. And there are similar other coping mechanisms in the system, in these systems, because they're much more used to the shocks and vulnerabilities. And these stressors is what it would be useful to understand better what is happening in different spaces. Now, what is happening in one case study will not necessarily apply in the other, but what I've tried to draw today is some similarities across, and these are some of the similarities that we found as during our research.
Very interesting. Well, folks, over to you all. Yes, please. I can see the hand immediately.
Thank you. That was really interesting. It struck me that the sorts of interventions that people are making that you described are the sorts of things that we're encouraging in agriculture here in terms of short supply chains, low inputs, those sorts of things. How much of what you've seen in the field is just traditional foodways continuing and not being sort of disrupted or modernized, and how much is adaptation to suit the scenario or the circumstance?
That's a very good question. What I find, I mean, the bit that I didn't talk about is a lot of the work that we have done in Kashmir about what happens to these food systems when conflict does come in. And what we find is the state is always trying to disrupt what is going on. And so there's always adaptation and new forms of ways of dealing with things. There are both things happening, going back to the previous ways of doing things, but also new ways of doing things. And sometimes some of the things work really well and some of the things don't work well. So an example is in Kashmir in particular, where I show these apples. What I haven't shown is, just kind of focusing on this fruit market. A lot of the apples over here are from what they now call high density apple trees. They're essentially like twigs and loads of apples on it. And what I realized doing a little bit of digging is, what is this high density thing they're talking about? It's the rootstock that NIAB, which is in East Malling, had produced like 10, 20 years ago, which has gone through multiple iterations by Italy, Bulgaria, and now goes to Kashmir. So there are both things that are going on with that, and that is dismantling the traditional ways and the resilient ways of producing things. So the quick answer is both the things are happening. It's still obviously a lot more complicated in terms of what benefits the people and what doesn't benefit the people.
Yes, please, and then over here, just behind you, Luke.
Going back to your comment about the diminishing role of the public sector, do you see the private sector taking over or encroaching upon the role of the state? And what do you think the role of the private sector is in food security?
Yeah, again, another really good question. I mean, that's what I was trying to alluding to when I was talking about the self-organizing nature of these spaces. I mean, are you talking about multinationals versus are you talking about private sector as in households grouping together and communities grouping together to generate, and to regulate the market, to create a market, to invest in the market. So this is what often happens is individual private companies may not find it useful to invest in these spaces because of the uncertainty inherent here. But the people who live there, if they self-organize, they do end up investing in those communities and through communities of care. So again, go back to the point of Apple, the market that I showed, this is all built by private money there. This is not a state-owned wholesale market, which in itself tells you the investment the private sector then does here. So there is a big role of this private sector, but perhaps not in the same multinational way.
I think it's a really important point. The private sector doesn't necessarily mean big. I saw a hand, I can't remember who they were, but anyway, let's start with you, madam, and then on we go. Yes.
Okay, thank you. How do you see resilience in cities? Because any conflict or problems happening, happen in the cities as well, and cities are not equipped to, store, produce, or any of these activities you've mentioned.
Yeah, I'll say two things. One, when cities in general, cities that are under sieges at the moment. So cities in general, one thing that I found during this research very interesting is that in Kashmir, or I'm sure this happens in other places, we use dandelion greens quite often. And I live in Hackney at the moment, and there's something called Hackney herbals, which if you are a food systems person should know about, and how they go around spaces in Hackney and in outer London to forage for dandelion greens, and how they're encouraging this use of things that are available to you. So I think one thing is about resilience, that looking in and out of the usual places to get your food, one is that thing. And I thought that was quite easily transferable from these kind of spaces, like reliance on like your local ecosystem for food that you're eating and going beyond just what is available in the supermarkets. Now, I think your question is more around cities and sieges. That's a very difficult one because the production in cities can be easily, or the distribution of food in cities can easily be halted by certain points, right? And to that, the examples that I've seen that work really well is, again, rural to urban connections and support systems. So at night, when food actually comes in from the rural side to the urban side and distributed without any money being exchanged during those sieges, right? Those are the examples I've seen. Now, in the long run, that's in the case of shocks. In case of stressors, it's very difficult to know how it can be sustained over a longer period of time. And in those kind of shock systems, people leave cities, right? That's why internal displacement happens. So that's, again, comes to the humanitarian side, and it's some acute malnutrition, acute food security problem, rather than, I guess, the problem that I was talking about slightly.
Let's have one last question. A very succinct question, please.
Yes, you've talked about sensitive areas like Kashmir, wherein the state is not on your side, right? So there's a lot of false news that comes out of false reporting. So how do you confirm the credibility of the information?
In relation to?
Especially Kashmir, wherein there's a lot of false media reporting.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, so there is so much. So I guess like the narrative is like critical, right? From these spacings. So for example, in Tigray at the moment, the stories that are coming out versus what is coming out, say even in Israel, Palestine, and Kashmir and India, and China and Tibet, and so on and so forth. It's very difficult. And I mean, as a researcher, what you rely on is academic work and very rigorous field work. And that's what my presentation is based on. Yeah.
It's a tricky one. Well, folks, I think we should draw a close to this part of the evening. First of all, thank you very much to Marush for a really good talk. So thank you for that. I invite you all to go up the stairs and down the stairs, whatever it is. Wherever there's a glass of whatever you'd like to drink, it will be provided, I hope. So thank you very much for coming this evening. Thanks very much for being part of this launch of IFSTAL Year 8. And for the students in the room who are just embarking on this, please, as I say, stay with us.